Before we start today's session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the unceded lands that we join each other today, where we live, work and play. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and the elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd like to offer my respects to the elders on the lands that I join you today. I'm joining you from the Kabi Kabi lands, but I've also lived and worked on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I was born on the lands of the Mandangi people. My job today is to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Sarah Jane Gregory, Sarah, is a senior lecturer in the School of Environment and Science at Griffith University. She's the convener of all work integrated learning courses for undergraduate and postgraduate programs, and she also teaches into the biomed program. Sarah's going to give her presentation today. After the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, and we'll also share some information about the next upcoming ACEN event. But without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to Sarah Jane Gregory.
Thank you so much, Faith. I'm just going to share my screen, and I apologize for the background noise. My husband seems to be in a meeting that he's not in. Oh, no, he's just put headphones on. Excellent. Hopefully. All right. So today we were having a conversation about what we might talk about. And one of my passions is assessment and authentic assessment that is beneficial to students and student outcomes. And so I thought it might be useful to talk about benchmarking of WIL assessment. As you know, WIL has become front and centre for experiential learning options in higher education in Australia. And TEXA is starting to pay quite a lot of attention to quality associated with WIL. So one of the big quality pieces, and it's not the only piece, is assessment associated with that. So I thought we would have a conversation about what assessment people are using and best practices. So as a stimulus, and I do not claim to be an expert, I've only been actually teaching WIL courses for the last 2 years, but I hope that what I've put into the slide deck, which will be available to you, Faith will send it out, or Nikki or Laura, one of them will send it out to you after the presentation, is some information that is stimulus, and you probably know some of it. And hopefully there's at least one thing that you'll learn that is new that will stimulate a discussion about what we are doing actively around benchmarking in WIL assessment. So I too would like to acknowledge country, and I'm coming today from also the lands of Kabi Kabi, and I've taught on numerous others not dissimilar to Faith. So welcome. So this slide deck is meant to be a conversation starter to prompt us to think about how are we delivering quality in WIL assessment. So that's going to include some context, some guidance statements, some examples, some thoughts about how to go about benchmarking and an exemplar, and some future focus of what we can do as the Queensland ACEN chapter. So let's start with a little bit of background. In WIL assessment. So we know 2015, there was a bit of movement around WIL in Australia, things like the integrated learning report for STEM that was commissioned for the Office of the Chief Scientist. And building on that was the strategy for work integrated learning in university education. So I've got lots of links in here, they'll be available to you as well. So that if you find interest in some of these things, you can go and follow them up. And those culminated in Universities Australia publishing a report in 2019 that sort of brought together lots and lots of things about different elements of work integrated learning. These are fairly umbrella, big picture, really rich documents. And there is focus on assessment, but it's at a high sort of meta level of, you know, we need good quality collaborative assessment and doesn't drill down. So we're kind of taking that microscopic look, drilling down at the nuts and bolts operationalization of WIL assessment and benchmarking for that. You should also be aware, and if you don't, this is an amazing document to go and have a look at. It's the framework to support assurance of institutional-wide quality in work integrated learning. So this is providing some of the initial address to Texas concerns about quality in higher education WIL experiences. And there is a lot of really good resource in the framework for this document. If you haven't seen it before, the general framework looks like this. There are 4 key domains with guiding principles of things that should happen before, during, and after placement. Today, we're kind of focusing on the curriculum design piece and very specifically on standard 2.7, which is the benchmarking of WIL assessment and identification of area for improvement. So some of you might also be aware that there is a TEXA guidance note for work integrated learning. If you don't, please have a look at it. It's really useful because it gives us some definitions of the types of things that WIL might include when we're talking about what types of things we might then evaluate and benchmark. Importantly, some of the other components of the framework from TEXA is around this part, learning outcomes and assessment and course design, and that the methods need to be both appropriate for level and the nature of learning. And we know in the nature of learning in WIL is quite different, it's very experientially based. So we also have some great examples of work on the ACEN website. If you haven't explored the case studies, then there are some really good examples of effective assessment design there. So Cradle is, of course, Deacon's Learning and Teaching Unit. So they have an assessment design strategy. We have literature that guides us. So Roller and Joe and Tran and David, of course, Liz Johnson from Deakin, Carol Joy Patrick from Griffith. So a really good series of documents that have come out of some national grant works around how to align assessment, how to make it authentic. We know that the purposes of assessment are different for different stakeholders. So for the university and for academics delivering WIL programs, it's around assurance of learning. For our students, it's around their ability to be prompted and articulate what they've learned and the skills they've developed. And for our industry partners, it's about creation and contribution to their work. So things like products and artifacts. So different stakeholders, very different reasons that they would engage with WIL assessment. We know that assessment needs to be adaptable to learning outcomes. It needs to have purpose for those activities, and student gains need to be met. So we need to meet the academic need and demand for an accredited course. We need to meet our client and industry expectations and also our student needs and expectations. And having so many different stakeholders in WIL can present a bit of challenge when it comes to assessment. But a recent article by David Bowd and co have identified, this was quite a small study, but quite pivotal identification of the role of assessment in WIL and how transformative assessment can be if it is effective. So we have assessment design principles for WIL that came from Bowd and Jawi and Tai. And these look at assessment that generates learning associated with experiential learning. It engages those students in the portrayal of their achievements in their placement work and developing their professional identity. It also involves collaboration between various stakeholders and reflects the nature of the learning that the students undertook during their activities. So fairly straightforward, they're fairly obvious principles, and there are lots of examples of types of assessment processes, from learning agreements and reflective assessment of variety, workplace feedback from both peers and co-workers, and portfolio assessment to capture all that learning. But we hit a little bit of a problem, and we have a bit of a dichotomous cohort because there are 2 types of experiential learning programs. One where you have degree programs and experiential learning courses where there is industry accreditation requirements or professional registration requirements to be met. And there is quite a variety of different programs in that. And then we have a non-industry accredited. So they're still accredited by TEXA. They have Cracos courses, but they don't have a professional industry standard requirement. So we think about the coupling of the curriculum and assessment and the placement in two different ways. When you have that accreditation, then we need really tight coupling, and there's a lot of prescription to a degree around that depending on the accrediting body. In non-accredited components, it's fairly loose and more flexible. So some of the disciplines where you might see these differences, and for me, I come from a STEM background, so STEM is focus, and I'm sure that you are able to relate in your own discipline where your program might sit. So when we have these differences, then assessment can be developed differently. In industry accredited programs, it needs to be discipline-based, and some of the concerns around that is that it may become quite prescriptive for students, this tick boxing type activity. I need to do these things, I statements and that sort of thing. Was a challenge with assessment for non-accredited, non-industry accredited programs is that there might be a lack of clear individual alignment depending on the need and depending on the cohort of students undertaking any given course. So when we come to benchmarking of that assessment, when you've got a course that is industry accredited or with professional registration, those bodies provide very guided mechanisms by which you can actually benchmark your assessment. Whereas in non-professional or non-accredited professions or courses, it's much more open to how we might benchmark what we're doing in assessment. And to throw in a little extra kettle of fish recently, of course, we're all aware of the advent of open access generative AI to the general public and what it means for WIL. And if you don't follow Francesca Tread's blog, I highly recommend it. Francesca is one of the Australian ACEN board members and a former director or chair. So Francesca published a blog really recently about the impacts of generative AI in WIL, and she made a really interesting point that is quite poignant to our discussion about benchmarking WIL. So we're not just testing knowledge, we're looking at representing practice situations, and assessment needs to examine that capacity for independent thinking, critical thinking, professional judgment, and professional responsibility. So that piece is about design, but the second paragraph I've highlighted is here so that you can read it better. Said, who can best assess this? It can't just be one person alone, because like practice, assessment should not be done alone. It needs to be, we need to do it in a collaborative, inclusive, and a respectful manner that provides feedback conversations, and that should be the heart of our WIL assessment. Hence the narrative around what are we doing benchmarking in WIL. So benchmarking, as TEXA describes it, as a structured collaborative learning process for comparing practices, processes, and performance outcomes. So that is what TEXA considers a benchmarking activity. There's lots of different types of things that you can benchmark. The university component itself, a course, a process, an outcome, or a best practice. So when you think about benchmarking assessment, it probably sits best under course benchmarking of design and performance in that assessment. So TEXA also has a guidance note for external referencing that includes benchmarking. So this is also a useful tool to go and have a look at if you are considering going about a benchmarking process for your WIL assessment. So you're hopefully wondering, all right, that's great, and I like the idea of this, but how do I actually go about doing this? And conversations, I always believe, need to have some good examples as starters. So it's no different to how you'd benchmark anything else. You can internally compare your WIL assessment to other WIL courses. So this requires you to go and hunt out who are other WIL courses. They're probably not in your school. They're probably in other schools. So finding those people and having conversations, connect with your colleagues, share your practice and what you are doing to get a feel for whether or not what you're doing sits well. And of course, there's a lot of different external comparisons that you can do. If you have industry accreditation requirements, that's a nice place to start. You can use the ACEN case study resources to compare to your own practice. Many of them, and we'll look at some examples today of how you might be able to utilize some of those case study resources. You can use information that is open access. So having a look at different institutions, looking at WIL programs that may be equivalent to yours, and doing essentially an audit. And I'm going to talk you through how I've done that previously as well. You can reach out to other colleagues, the same as you would in WIL courses in your institute, reach out to colleagues in other institutes. And of course, you can undertake the formal benchmarking university processes, and you'll have a central unit that is responsible for doing this somewhere. You may have to do a little bit of investigative work to find them. So let's have a look at benchmarking in the ACEN case studies and how you might use them. So here is an example from Deakin, and Deakin has a lot of examples. They're really, really proactive in the WIL space. So this one happens to be a STEM example, and we're looking at expanding capstone. So each of the case studies has a lot of common questions that are asked to be answered. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the things that you might be able to use in a benchmarking scenario. So one of the questions is, how does the activity embed successful evaluation processes? So this might give you an idea of some of the types of assessment that was used in a particular case study, when they were provided, how they were supported, how students were informed. It also gives you people that you could go and talk to about potentially benchmarking your own work. So that's one example. We've got portfolios, we've got interviews, using of rubrics. These are all different pieces of information that you can actually capture and compare to your own WIL courses. So another example, this one happens to be a Griffith example of the tax clinic. So the tax clinic is a WIL experience that is a real tax clinic supported by academics to allow undergraduates to practice tax. And there's an inclusion process and a vetting process of who can do that. What I wanted to draw your attention to is that there are other questions. So how will the WIL activity be integrated into curricula? So things like assigning assessment that includes reflective diaries, presentations, academic papers, marking to a rubric again, if you're in business and tax, this might be a group of people that you could go and talk to about your particular assessment to benchmark. So then there's benchmarking to your institutional goals, which should be part of good design, but isn't necessarily always overt. So ensuring that every graduate has a capstone experience that is work-related, such as an internship, international mobility, research participation, or an international and national competition. This is Griffith's institutional goal around WIL. I'm sure if you have a look at some of your university documents, you will find very, very similar type goals and statements. So, and that's removed my line. So those institutional goals, you might have a look in your academic plan. You might also look in the strategic plan for the university. Now, again, they're going to be high level, but you can still look at how your assessment benchmarks to some of those activities. You can also have a look at program design principles. Your institutes will probably have some not dissimilar, and you'll see the focus on partnerships and local and globally connected fit very, very well into the WIL paradigm. There are also other resources. So in lots of universities have different frameworks that you can map your WIL assessment to. So for us at Griffith, we have a learning and teaching capabilities framework. If we have a look at other institutional frameworks, so that's the Griffith one again, but UTS has just published a really good example from Francisca again and Dimity Ware. So looking at in media, they have a typology for WIL. So this is looking at developmental practice, and there are a number of different categories, and assessment is one of those categories. So again, gives you an idea of the types of activities and opportunities for benchmarking that you might have. You can also benchmark to WIL assessment frameworks. So this is another case study, again, Deakin University, and again, STEM, sorry for that. But, you know, this is where some of the really good work in the case studies on the ACEN site are. So Deakin has an embedded WIL assessment framework, and there are examples within the case study that you can refer to of the types of things that might be used for assessment. So if you've not seen the assessment framework, so it looks at authenticity and proximity and development. So this is another thing that you can actually benchmark your own WIL assessment to in terms of evidencing quality assessment. You can, of course, benchmark to the literature as well. That can be a little bit challenging. It's an area where quality WIL assessment isn't necessarily a commonly published area. So this is a great place that you could go and explore if you've done your benchmarking comparative and want to share some of the things you've done. So in Australia, the Australian Council of Deans of Science, Teresa Winchester-Seto, has published her quality and standards for work integrated learning. It includes assessment and things around what should be assessed and how they should be assessed. And so that's really useful if you are in a science discipline to benchmark your assessment to, are you meeting some of these sorts of requirements? So in this last bit, I just wanted, before we start talking about things, I wanted to share a benchmarking case in practice, which is one that I did when I first took over WIL courses. So in semester 2 of 2021, I convened my first WIL course ever. I inherited it, and then I was required to do a moderation report for our assessment board. So this is it was a great opportunity for me to sort of take what I'd been given and actually go, is it any good? How do I know? How can I compare it? So there are lots of different things, and my intention is not for you to be able to read that at all, but it is examples of the types of things I did for this benchmarking of assessment. So we're looking at what existed, where it existed, what was in the literature. That's some of what I've shared already. And then cross-marking practices, how we are evaluating assessment, those sorts of things. Now, I thought about, well, I need to compare it to something. And that comparison was to Australian Science WIL courses and course profile information. I didn't have the time. I was only given quite short notice to do the moderation report. That's the turnaround in a trimester. And what I realized was I needed a data set. And I'm a scientist, so my data set became a spreadsheet that then informed that benchmarking. And I'm happy to share this if anyone wants to see the whole spreadsheet of what I did. But in sharing what was in that spreadsheet, I think is more valuable in understanding how we benchmark for assessment. So externally, I didn't have enough time to actually get in a room with academics, but it's all right, I'll look at university course descriptors. Lots of them are available. There's different levels of information depending on the university. But my spreadsheet consisted of a number of different things I wanted to look at. So who the university was, were they an IRU university like Griffith is, or were they a GO8, an ATN, et cetera, how much a unit was worth, how much time students were spending on a WIL placement, in that, what the learning outcomes were, the learning activities to support the placement, assessment items, and the weighting of those assessment items. If there were task descriptions, it's not common to be able to get down to that detailed level from an external facing. And then if there was any course coordinators, who could I talk to? And so that formed my data set. And then from that, I was able to make informed information about whether the assessment in my course was actually of quality. So what did I find in doing that? I was really heartened to see that there's a number of institutes that have alignment that's really good practice. So it aligns with literature about assessment in WIL, and it's aligning with some of those key bodies, so ACEN and Universities Australia, around what is considered good WIL assessment. There's a variety of different support for students, and it's variable from no support to documentation to external supports, outsourcing of supports to things like existing MOOCs or books or websites. And most commonly for assessment, there were three main varieties. There was a reflective report of some description, and there was the variations on what that report was, and industry partner evaluation. And there was quite a lot of variation on how industry voice of student performance was incorporated. But those two things, high commonality across all WIL courses that I had a look at. Also, a large proportion of portfolio development and reflective journaling. So really unpacking what is it that students did on placement, how that impacts them, how they can use that going forwards. And then some form of oral showcase that either was in person or remote, that could be captured and shared as a video artifact, those kinds of things. So when you have an idea of what other people are doing, it allows you to reflect on your own assessment as well. And that's good assessment practice, just anywhere. So that is all I really want to talk about. And it really is a guide, just some thought-provoking information that hopefully you've had some sort of an aha moment, or I'm on the right track moment, or, oh, I never thought of looking there before moment. And we thought that we might use Poll Everywhere. If you've not used Poll Everywhere, it's a lovely free tool. It does have a limitation of numbers. So I actually have a license so we can all participate today, which is terrific. So we've set up a number of questions. So one of the things we were talking about was we didn't actually know what anybody in the chapter was doing around benchmarking assessment, and that maybe this was a really good way to start to capture and to start conversations about who has done anything, how are they doing anything, and what might be processes that we can implement. How can the Queensland chapter support benchmarking WIL assessment? Because in our narrative around quality and quality assurance, assessment is really, really an important component. So there are several questions. I'll leave that up for you, and I've summarized them at the end. So anyone who is watching this back later who might not be able to participate in the survey directly, although I'll leave it open, so you're welcome to do that. I've also put the questions there later for your own personal reflection. So let's just take let's say 5 minutes for everyone to work through those questions. And I will stop sharing my screen for the moment and go back to being able to see everybody.
So Sarah, while people are completing the survey, I've just completed it. Thank you very much. I might just go through some of the comments that have been put in the chat for you, if that's okay. Absolutely. So Leonie Russell has mentioned that there are lots of great articles in IJ WIL. And Leonie, you mentioned the new International Handbook on Work Integrated Learning. Does that have anything about assessment in there? I can't remember.
Yes, it is. So if you have, ask your library to get hold of it. If you haven't, yes, there's lots in there.
All right.
Lovely to
it's
see.
Expensive. You're not going out there to buy a the hardcover version. Just get your library to get it.
And Joanna Tai has also shared an article. Joanna, are you in the session still to talk about that article?
Hi. Yes, I'm here. And wow, thanks, Sarah Jade. I was like, oh, there's all this stuff that my name's on.
It's actually like we actually need to talk about all the good stuff that Australian will practitioners are doing. And this is a nice opportunity to say, hey, look, there is stuff there. People don't know, and particularly new people. And the chapter bringing in new
I
people.
just looked at that other book, I think that Leonie popped up, and Jenny Brentnell and colleagues wrote the assessment chapter in that book as well. So I think, you know, there's some really great work going on. So I agree. Yeah.
Now, Christy Collis has mentioned that private higher ed providers face unique benchmarking challenges. Christy, did you want to come on and talk about some of those challenges?
Sure. Well, it's mostly as indicated. We don't have, I don't have enough degrees running in my organization to be able to do internal benchmarking of the various WIL components. Like we run five degrees, but it's a bit small for internal benchmarking, so I have to go to external. Now, everyone, you're hearing me learning about a new sector because I've been in private for a year after like 30 odd years in public university. So I'm just adjusting. One of the adjustments is our data is commercial in confidence. So if there's anything about student outcomes, numbers of students moving through WIL programs or pieces of WIL assessment, we can't share that. And weirdly, like in the private sector, our colleagues are our competitors, so it's actually quite difficult to get an MOU up for external benchmarking across this sector. So there's just some unique challenges, and so far the answer has been peer review portal. But I'm just throwing it in there because, you know, there's 137 of us out here, private higher education providers supporting 10% of the country's higher education students, and it's really difficult for us to benchmark our WIL.
Absolutely. Thanks, Christy. And I think that there is that scope. So when you do have those commercial limitations, the ability to benchmark to perhaps existing practice and examples is a way to say, well, here is existing practice and we are emulating that good practice. There is a good practice guide for WIL assessment on the ACEN site as well. There was talk of that needing to be updated. So I'm sure that's coming. But it's thanks for raising that issue, Christy.
Denise, you mentioned EROS. You used EROS to benchmark with AUT. How easy was that to access?
Yeah, hi there. I actually got the details from Jude Smith originally, but I think they're available via Google, and it was really useful. It was a really comprehensive tool. We found that AUT have a big, like a mandatory WIL offering in business. So they have quite, you know, it's a big volume program. And we found it really useful. We just did it, we weren't required to do it. We just did it kind of voluntarily. And it did the full span of assessments and content, hours, the whole raft of things that were mentioned in the presentation. So I would definitely recommend using that if you haven't got tools provided to you.
I have a question, Sarah. You know, this is great, kind of considering quality and assessment and benchmarking. Is there a space to get industry input and feedback in the way we do assessment and what's been done in that space? I think it's really important to get the industry perspective.
There is, I think, in the WIL space, we're going through this journey of going from that top level high, how do we get WIL working in Australia? And now that that's going really well, we've got a good 15 years of development of that. We're starting to really nut down into those deeper, more nitty gritty, how do we make this bit really good? And assessments in that category. Kerry Russo was hoping to be here with us, but has been unable to. One of the things she was going to talk about, and please follow this up, she was at HERTSA and did a great presentation exactly around assessment and collaborative assessment design and evaluation with industry. And there are some examples from some institutions. It's really about institutions or individuals, depending on who you've got supporting you in WIL courses, reaching out to your industry partners and inviting them in to start conversations about assessment and what they see as a value. It's a really nice two-way street. because then you are able to feed in, you know, what type of tools they're using, what type of artifacts and outputs industry are doing in a day-to-day now. It gives you currency to implement them in other areas of your degree program, not just in WIL. Sometimes that's a bit tricky. It takes time, it takes money. Perhaps your industry providers don't have the ability to contribute in a way that's meaningful for you. I've been being a little bit sneaky and using a different methodology. So in my WIL courses, I have a requirement, and I'm sure I'm not the only one doing this. I'm sure lots of people are actually doing this, where part of the course assessment is a requirement for the students to produce or deliver things that are specifically of benefit to the industry partner. Partnership is a two-way street. If it is not mutually beneficial, it's not a good partnership, and we can do better. So what my students have been doing is they're actually been negotiating with their industry partners. That's one of the first things they have to do, is to negotiate what is it that I can contribute to your industry that would be of benefit to you, and how is it of benefit? And then they are reporting that back in their portfolio assessment. So for me, I'm not needing to actually always or have those really extensive, expansive conversations. We're still doing them. And the JCU example from Kerry Russo is an excellent example of how they're doing that successfully in co-design with students and industry. But if you can't do that, it's quite a good proxy to build it into assessment. And I don't care what that is, because at the heart of it, it's what industry wants. What do they want our undergraduates and our postgraduates to be working on that helps them? And then that can feed back as well.
I think it's interesting where students see value in their assessment as well. And Leonie, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just, a couple of things. I agree with Denise about using EROS. Jude Smith led a project. It's on the ACEN website. I have put it in the chat. It's called The Edge, and it was around how do we evidence entrepreneurial capabilities that students are developing throughout WIL. And one of the key things we did in that major project, I think it was an ATN group of universities, we went to industry. We invited industry and asked them, what are the capabilities you want students to have, and how do you want them to evidence it? Because we know their academic transcript won't tell you anything. So we got them to say, you know, what sort of interview questions or what artifacts would you like to see from students? And the website on Edge gives you some examples of the evidencing strategies that were developed. So industry was saying, we want students to be able to articulate the process they went through to get to the end product, not just hand us a report that they did, because that's what's more valuable. So I think, and the EROS process was great because we did this across 5 universities. And so it's really worth using it to benchmark. I'll be quiet now.
Oh, no, listen, thanks, Leonie.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments that they'd like to share? No?
Yeah, it's Jeremy Taylor from Central Queensland University, looking after paramedicine. Paramedicine have got accreditation standards, but no national placement assessment tools yet, but I'm on a working group that actually is setting that up from a national perspective. But I'm interested around paper versus digital. There are obviously pros and cons, especially from an access perspective, but there's one of the cons about being able to roll up some of the data and actually being able to analyze that a little bit more over for a longitudinal study. The other issue is around where does the university endorsed or supported placement management systems kick in when it comes to WIL assessments, and where's that overlap, and what your experiences is with those, given that most universities in Australia operate within one of 2 of the placement management systems.
Sarah?
Thanks, Jeremy. For me, I don't sit in any accredited courses, so it's kind of harder for me to say. Karen, are you there? You might be able to speak to that a little bit. Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's all right. I'm just turning myself on. Good afternoon, everyone. I do. I work across undergrad and postgrad, accredited and non-accredited. So question, Jeremy, was really around basically where assessment should sit.
No. So just two parts of the question is from your experience around how engaging or successful, for better words, paper versus digital WIL assessments is. But the other aspect is, where does the placement management systems, for example, In Place or Sonia for better, fit within the delivery and the management of work integrated learning assessments as well, given that there is functionality within both of those to actually support WIL assessments?
I don't support using those functions for the use of assessment at all. They are a process within us for students to do pre-placement activities, and all their information and everything is stored, because I consider placement WIL is a course. Therefore, it should sit within your course, even if you're using Padlet and things like that to actually get your assessment together and for students to interact. So it depends on the course requirements, together with the accreditation principles that align what you may need to assess, or whether you have the ability to not. So for instance, the difference between an accreditation course with human services, social work, we all have different parameters. We're able to assess and allow the student to align what their learnings are for their progression. Whereas if I was to look at physio, they have set areas that they must be targeted off against. So it does depend and has a lot to do. So using any sort of e-platform does need to make sure it aligns, and that students aren't then having to spend more time on learning how to use that than actually learning in the field, where their assessments should directly align with what they're learning in the field for future employment.
Feedback. My only thing is that they're already engaged in the placement management systems for the exact reasons that you mentioned. So they're socializing the use of it. Is just an extension of their existing usage.
No, it's not. It's an admin site to a course site, and you can't blend those, because I have students all the time sending a course convener's question to Sonia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that bit I do agree with. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it needs to have that clear thing on what Sonia is used for and what you have your course site used for. And it has wonderful opportunities for different types of e-portfolios, e-learning opportunities, and you know, AI opportunities as well, especially with e-health.
So from a industry perspective, because I actually look after placements for all the paramedics in Queensland.
Yes.
Is that here's the challenge in regards to engagement with industries about the digital space in regards to what digital platforms work, because in an operational environment, it's different to many other disciplines, with the utmost respect, that it is different from a context that they're doing assessments at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning on the side of the road or in a different environment. So how does, and that probably comes back to my earlier conversation around paper-based versus digital.
Yes, both are needed, and both always will be. Sorry, Sarah Jane. Both are needed, both always will be. But we need to ensure either type that is used, the students are affluent in using them, or they have the opportunities to actually learn how to use them in practice. Does that help?
It does a bit. And there's some comments in the chat from Denise and Christy and Laura around using various tools like In Place and Sonia. We've actually moved away. Well, for me, I've moved away from using Sonia for industry, because industry really struggle. It's extra time to learn another piece of software that is of no value to them particularly, which is very problematic. But I agree with Karen, there is place and space for both paper and digital, and it's going to be quite discipline specific and industry accreditation specific as to what industry accreditation is comfortable with, as well as to whether they need to see that hard documentation or they are satisfied with digital versions thereof. And that's probably just going to be conversations and continuing conversations with accrediting bodies around, you know, what is practice, what works, are there alternatives as well? Yeah, and maybe talking and using PebblePad. Deakin uses Kazan, of course. So there's lots of different tools. It's a bit about exploring and awareness, and then talking to people who've used them before as well to see how they're using them. And that's that benchmarking piece again. How are people meeting some of those higher level expectations around assessment? So how are you meeting the collaboration? How are you meeting authentic? How are you meeting student evidencing? And that's shared practice. It really, really is. You only know what you know, but you can always find out more.
Some more comments about PebblePad being a great dynamic interface for industry and academics. Karen D'Souza talks about medicine at Deakin using Kaizen for workplace-based assessment, now called RISA. Then you say you mentioned you need a lot of training for students and assessors. And I think Wendy Hood was speaking about occupational therapy as accredited, has a licensed national assessment tool. So that might be something that you're interested in, Jeremy, as well. So you mentioned that you know, for example, Christy, you don't have an option to access benchmarking in the private higher ed, but and Jeremy, you've got some questions about paper versus digital. And I think there's a lot of knowledge and resources. Leonie and Denise have shared a lot of resources in the room. I noticed, Sarah, in your survey, you asked people if they're interested in a community of practice about benchmarking. So if you haven't completed the survey, maybe you could put the QR
Yes, I was going to share my screen again.
Results. Do you have any results so far?
Yes, there's 9, which is great. So if I just share my screen, for some reason it's not allowing the embedded, so we'll just go with the website instead. Oh, there we go. All right, so if we have a look at what our results are. So, why is it not allowing me to show results? Okay, that's interesting. Oh no. All right. For whatever reason it so desires, Poll Everywhere has decided. I'm just going to deactivate it and see if it'll let me look at the responses. Normally you get a button that allows you to share responses in the present mode. Okay. It might not let me. That would be very those results into a document to share with everyone who's attended so that we can, and Zoom's decided to die on me too, so that we can have a look at those results and be aware of anyone who would like to engage in that process. We were looking at positives and negatives of benchmarking and hurdles. So that was something I was quite interested in, is what do people perceive the hurdles to be in undertaking benchmarking activities? Given that we all have to evidence to TAXA that we have quality programs with quality evaluative mechanisms, what is it that people think would be a hurdle to them actually undertaking a benchmarking activity? Oh no, I've got hang on, I've got this share, I can share my thing and it's just come up. It's like, oh, that is so curious. All right.
I've just put your email in the chat for anybody that might would like to get in contact about a community of practice around benchmarking.
Yep. Here we go. All right. We'll just scroll back. So these are the results of the poll from people who were here today. So that's really great to see. So of the 10 people who have replied, about half, just under half, have actually done benchmarking of WIL previously, which is great, at an internal. And I would hope that anyone who's been having to moderate would have done that. Then we have, that's internal. Oh, here we go. Externally. All right, we've got more or less the same. So that's internal. Where's that external? No. Okay, there's some funky things going on. So quite an even split between people who require accreditation and not in the room, which is good to know that it's, you know, there's different things going on. So benefits perceived gives you good insights into your course. Quality, best practice, texture compliance, these are all good reasons. I realize industry engagement, minimizing mental fatigue. Mental fatigue can be quite a challenge in placement associated work. So really, so these are all things that you can advocate why your assessment is of quality and how it helps support those things. Sorry, for some reason the PowerPoint just wants to jump. All right, so let's have a look at the next question, which is barriers. So barriers to WIL benchmarking. So student privacy, and Christy's raised some of the issues around corporate knowledge and corporate information, student privacy, time, and lack of publicly available data. Reduction of tenured staff, so less people to actually assist workload. So we might give some thought to providing opportunities, and Denise and various other of our ACEN execs have shared a number of ways in which you might be able to support undertaking benchmarking that is less time and less workload, that gives you access to some really good data to evidence the quality of your courses. So quite a lot of people keen to undertake peer review, or not sure yet, who'd like to, but perhaps can't see yet a way forward or a time in how to do it. So as a chapter, we can think about how to support that better. And
Leonie's got her hand up again. Sorry, Leonie. Yeah.
No, that's all right. I just
stopped sharing my screen.
That's right. I was just thinking of, you know, the journeys of benchmarking WIL assessments over the years, and I found it easier to do with other institutions, and obviously that's using my ACEN buddies, to hand over, hey, this is what they're using in business as an internship assessment. And it's not about student results. It's here's the course learning outcomes, and here's the piece of assessment. And that sort of sharing has happened quite well. And then you can ask questions and no one's terribly embarrassed at all. But within my own institution, when I asked through my WIL community of practice, hey everyone, can you send me your WIL assessments? There's deathly silence. I don't know whether they think I'm the WIL policewoman or something. I don't know. But I'm just trying to pull together best practice, who's doing a great job. So they won't share them publicly on our staff WIL community of practice, but people will email them to me like it's a secret or something. You know, I'm just looking for good practice to help others who are saying to me, I have no idea how to assess this. What's some good examples? So I like to get a library full of examples to show.
And I wonder, Leonie, if it's that lacking of confidence that we have, that, you know, it's an academic failing, that we're all non-confident about anything we do, even though we're quite capable and resourceful. And that actually that sharing of practice is a way to help overcome that as well. Yeah. Because when you show someone and they go, this is amazing, this is like so empowering for students and for industry, that we actually need that positive feedback, or, oh, I've never thought of it doing it that way. Those sorts of conversations, and maybe it is the casual conversation over coffee that we need to be promoting in a discussion, not around student outcomes, but around design that is known to be impactful.
Yeah, I think one experience of numerous experiences that I've seen is where the students do amazing things in WIL. It's not all about placement. They do amazing things, but then they're completely let down because the piece of assessment is rubbish and it doesn't allow the student to really talk about what they did and how they were exciting. You know, they have to write a journal article against graduate attributes or something boring like that. So I think the benchmarking helped sit back and have a look at exciting things that they're doing, and then go backwards, then revisit, is your piece of assessment allowing students to evidence their competence and joy in what they learned? So go backwards is a good idea.
Yeah, and that competency. So I have mine because we're science, but I have students across a huge number of different degree programs and disciplines in my WIL courses. And so you can't do a discipline specific assessment like you can in an industry accredited professional pathway with a clear professional identity. So I have them mapped to science threshold learning outcomes as an example of evidencing competencies and capabilities. And that's quite a nice narrative to showcase. And the deliverables piece gives them some of that really nice evidence that they can then talk about with future employers, to share on their LinkedIn profiles, all that sort of thing.
So thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. I know everyone's looking, we've got to move on to our next meetings, but I would like to thank everybody who joined us today. And thank you, Sarah, for a fantastic presentation. I've taken a lot of resources away. The next Queensland chapter meeting will be on the 29th of August. And I know some people aren't from Queensland, but we welcome everybody up north. We'll provide an overview of our upcoming committee roles available. Hint, hint, anybody would like to nominate for a chair or a chapter or a secretary role. And we've got our AGM to be held on the 12th of September, and other chapters you'll have to check when your chapter elections will be on. And don't forget, the next ACEN webinar is writing across the professions, and I've also put the link to that in the chat. So please join me in giving Sarah Jane a round of applause. Yay, thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for joining, and I look forward to seeing you at the next session. Take care.